The first light of dawn spilled across the valley, painting the old wooden cabin in shades of gold and gray. The air was crisp, still damp from the night's fog, and silence hung over the clearing like a held breath. Ansel Ridgway, barely 15 but older in spirit, sat up on the narrow cot inside the cabin, startled by a strange sound, soft hoofbeats approaching through the brush. When he stepped outside, barefoot on the cold porch, he froze. A small, dusty donkey stood quietly in front of the cabin, as if it had always belonged there. The donkey didn't flinch. Its big, dark eyes locked on Ansel's, and for a moment they simply stared at each other. Ansel had grown up around farms. He knew animals didn't just wander into places like this unless they were lost or sent. This one wasn't wild. It was calm, almost expectant. Hanging from a worn leather strap around its neck was a small metal canister, barely the size of a flashlight. Ansel's heart thumped as he stepped forward and unhooked it. The canister was sealed with wax on both ends. His fingers trembled slightly as he cracked it open and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was old, the edges yellowed and fragile, but the ink was clear. He's alive. Follow the trail north. Just 6 words, but they knocked the air right out of his chest. Ansel sank onto the porch, staring down at the message as if it might change if he read it again. He hadn't heard that name spoken in years. His grandfather, Harlan Ridgway, had vanished before Ansel was even born. Some said he died in a fire up north. Others swore he'd run off into the wilderness, leaving behind a trail of silence and pain. His mother refused to talk about him. And now, this. Out of nowhere, a message from someone who shouldn't exist, delivered by a donkey with eyes too knowing to be ordinary. Bramble, as Ansel instinctively named him, lowered his head and nudged Ansel's knee, as if urging him to move. The trail north was dense, steep, and dangerous, but suddenly it felt like the only place left to go. Whoever sent that message knew where to find him, knew when to find him. That terrified Ansel more than anything. He stood slowly, brushing dirt off his jeans, eyes fixed on the woods. The sun had risen, but the path ahead remained cloaked in shadow. Ansel packed lightly. A worn canvas backpack, a water flask, 2 granola bars, and the old hunting knife his grandfather had left behind, back when people still believed he might return. He hesitated at the doorway of the cabin, scanning the trees one last time. There was no one out there, but he couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching him even before Bramble appeared. The forest had gone quiet again. That deep, unnatural quiet that pressed on your ears like water underwater. Bramble trotted ahead, tail flicking, hooves steady on the uneven trail. It was strange how the little donkey didn't hesitate at all. He moved like he knew where to go. Ansel followed, his boots crunching over dead leaves and twigs, heart pounding with every step. The sun climbed higher through the mist, filtering in weak rays between tall pines. Hours passed, though Ansel couldn't tell how many. The farther they went, the colder the air became. It wasn't just the elevation. It was something else. A tension in the trees. A waiting. By midday, they reached a ridge overlooking the valley. From there, Ansel could see the winding dirt road miles below, the last road he had taken before finding the cabin. Bramble stopped near a pile of stones, and Ansel noticed something glinting between them. He knelt down and brushed away the loose earth. There, hidden beneath a flat rock, was a small tin box. He pried it open. Inside were 2 things, a black and white photo of a man standing next to a younger version of Bramble, and a compass, cracked but still intact. Ansel stared at the photo. The man in it was unmistakable, same jawline, same eyes. Harlan Ridgway, his grandfather. But what hit him hardest wasn't the image. It was the date written on the back in faded pencil, October 12, 2009, North Trail. That was the same week Ansel had been born. His grandfather had been alive, not lost to the woods or gone in a fire. Alive and leaving clues, buried pieces of a puzzle only someone in the family could understand. The compass needle spun, then slowly settled north. Ansel held it tightly, his throat dry. All his life, he'd lived in the silence his family built around Harlan. Now the silence was cracking, and the truth was whispering through pine trees and hoofbeats. He didn't know what he'd find ahead, but someone had gone to great lengths to make sure he came. And now, there was no turning back. The trail grew steeper after the ridge, winding between blackened tree trunks and broken branches that looked like twisted fingers clawing at the sky. Ansel noticed how the forest changed, quieter, older, scarred. The trees here had burned, though no one had spoken of a fire in this part of the woods for years. Bramble slowed down, his hooves sinking into the soft, gray ash as they descended into a shallow valley. The air smelled faintly of smoke, long faded but not forgotten. It clung to the ground like memory. Ansel crouched near a fallen log, brushing his fingers along a half-buried metal tag nailed into the bark. The number etched into it, 1273, meant nothing to him, but the fact that someone had been marking trees was unsettling. Bramble stood a few feet ahead, ears perked, tail still. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp snort and turned his head toward the woods. Ansel followed his gaze and saw them. Footprints. Human. Recent. The ash hadn't had time to settle inside them. He froze. Someone else had passed through here, maybe hours before. The prints led deeper into the trees, away from the marked path. For a second, Ansel considered turning back. But the compass in his pocket, now more of a talisman than a tool, seemed to weigh heavier with every step. He couldn't let go of the thought that his grandfather was still leading him, deliberately, carefully, from beyond whatever silence had buried him. 30 minutes later, they reached what looked like the remains of an old shack, barely a skeleton of wood and rusted nails. Bramble refused to go any closer, braying softly, backing up with unease. Ansel tied him to a nearby branch and approached alone. Inside, the ground was littered with old tools, broken glass, and something that stopped him cold, a leather-bound notebook protected inside a metal tin. He picked it up and flipped through it. The handwriting was messy but familiar. He had seen it once, on an old envelope in his mother's locked drawer. The first page read, "If someone finds this, then the story isn't over." Ansel sat in the cold dirt, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. There were maps, dates, letters never sent, mentions of people he didn't know: O. Granger, C. Wexler, Deputy Vance. And always at the margins, one phrase: "Don't trust the fire." He didn't know what it meant yet, but he felt the heat of it, something deeper than flames. Something buried in his blood. Ansel couldn't tear his eyes from the notebook. The pages were soaked in time, smudged pencil marks, fingerprints in the margins, the corners curled with moisture and age. But the writing was deliberate. It wasn't rambling or confused. It was structured, like someone had been preparing to be found, or preparing someone else to follow. The name Harlan appeared only once, in a clipped sentence. "If they come, tell Ansel about the fire. Tell him about Caroline." Caroline. His mother's name. He had asked her once, when he was younger, if she'd ever seen a fire in the mountains. She'd stiffened, looked away, and told him never to go looking for answers in ashes. Now that warning echoed louder than ever. Ansel turned another page and found a letter folded inside, never sealed, but carefully placed. The handwriting was tighter, more emotional. To Iris, it began. That was his mother's middle name. The message was short: "Forgive me. I thought hiding it would keep you safe. But it only kept us all chained." Ansel felt something twist deep in his chest. His grandfather hadn't abandoned them. He had been watching, hiding, writing, preparing. But from what? Bramble pawed at the dirt outside, growing restless. The forest around them had grown darker, even though the sun hadn't yet set. Ansel tucked the notebook carefully into his bag, then looked once more around the ruins of the shack. Scratches marked the wooden beams. Tallies, perhaps. 11 of them. As if someone had been counting days. Or visits. They continued north, following the compass and the pattern of disturbed leaves left by whoever had passed earlier. Bramble moved slower now, and Ansel noticed the donkey's head would occasionally turn toward the deeper woods, ears twitching at sounds he couldn't hear. At one point, Ansel thought he saw movement between the trees, just a flicker of a shadow, low and fast, but when he stopped to look, there was nothing. Stillness had returned like a threat. As dusk fell, they reached a clearing with a rusted metal gate half buried in vines. Beyond it lay what once might have been a homestead, stone foundation, charred wood beams, and a rusted mailbox, the name barely legible beneath layers of soot. C. Wexler. One of the names from the journal. Ansel's pulse quickened. This wasn't coincidence anymore. This was a trail. He stepped through the gate, heart hammering in his chest. A cold breeze swept through the clearing, and in that moment, Bramble stopped walking. The donkey stood still, staring at something only he could see. The moment Ansel stepped through the gate, the air changed. It was heavier here, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Bramble lingered outside the clearing, unwilling to cross. Ansel didn't blame him. The Wexler homestead wasn't just abandoned, it felt erased. The stones of the foundation were scorched black, and the skeletal remains of what had been a porch sagged inward like a collapsed ribcage. A shattered lantern hung crookedly from a rusted hook. Everything here told a story of something that ended suddenly and violently. He stepped carefully over fallen beams and broken glass, scanning for anything that hadn't turned to ash. Inside what remained of the structure, he found a cast-iron stove warped by heat and a row of melted picture frames still clinging to the wall. Only one photo had survived. He wiped away the soot and studied the faces. A young woman with dark eyes, holding a baby. Behind her stood a man with a thick beard and tired expression. At the bottom, in faded ink, Charlotte Wexler, 1985. Charlotte. Another name from the journal. Had she known Harlan? Had she hidden him? Or had they both been running from the same thing? Ansel felt a cold pressure at the back of his neck. Not fear, exactly, something older, like memory passed down in the blood. He turned the frame over and found a brittle envelope taped to the back. Inside was a folded letter addressed simply, "To the boy with Harlan's eyes." He read it slowly, fingers trembling. "You found what they buried. Not just the home, but the lie. Harlan never left because he wanted to. They made him. They burned this place to erase the truth. But it survived. You survived. If you made it here, you're already in danger. Someone is watching. Keep moving. Find the white pine tree with the cut stone beneath it. Go alone." Ansel stared at the words, feeling the weight of something ancient settling on his shoulders. Whoever wrote this knew he would come, knew exactly what he'd be looking for. And if they were right, he wasn't alone out here, not in the way he thought. Behind him, Bramble let out a low, uncertain bray. Ansel turned sharply. The woods beyond the gate looked different now. He could feel eyes on him, not imagined, but real, patient, silent, close. The kind of presence that waits, not to scare you, but to stop you. And night was coming fast. Ansel didn't sleep that night. He stayed near the edge of the Wexler clearing, wrapped in his jacket, with Bramble lying close by, ears twitching at every snap of twig. The fire he built was small, more for comfort than warmth. His thoughts looped in circles, about the letter, about Charlotte, about the warning. "You're already in danger." That sentence wouldn't leave him. He kept scanning the tree line, convinced something was out there, just beyond the reach of firelight. By dawn, the fog had thickened. Everything felt muted, like the forest was hiding something under a shroud. With the notebook, the photo, and the new letter tucked securely in his pack, Ansel and Bramble pushed forward. The compass needle pointed slightly northeast now. He wasn't sure if he trusted it anymore, or if he just needed something to believe in. The white pine tree mentioned in the letter. How many could there be? 2 hours into the hike, they reached a grove where the trees grew unnaturally tall and close. Most were fir or spruce, but there, near a fallen log, stood a single white pine, its bark paler than the others, its base flanked by mossy rocks. Bramble stopped suddenly, refusing to go closer. His ears flattened. Ansel moved slowly toward the base of the tree, scanning the ground until he saw it, a flat stone slab, half buried in dirt and pine needles. He dropped to his knees and began brushing it off. The stone was cut into a perfect rectangle, smoother than anything natural. At one end, carved into the edge, were the initials HR. He froze. Harlan Ridgway. It wasn't a grave. It didn't feel like that. It felt like a door. Ansel gripped the edges and tried to lift it. It was heavy, sealed tight by years of soil and roots, but with enough leverage and effort, it finally gave way. Beneath the stone was a metal box, the kind used for storing tools. He pulled it out, heart hammering. Inside, photographs, sealed envelopes, and a small tape recorder wrapped in plastic. His fingers trembled as he turned it over and saw a label written in fading ink, "Play me first." The batteries were old, but to his surprise, when he pressed play, the tape whirred softly and a voice broke through the static. "If you're hearing this, it means you're ready. They lied to you, Ansel. They lied to all of us." It was Harlan's voice. Alive or not, his story had just begun. Ansel held the recorder tightly, his hands cold despite the growing daylight. Harlan's voice, crackling through the tape, felt too real, too close. It wasn't just sound. It was presence, the kind of voice that filled a room. For a moment, Ansel forgot where he was. He wasn't in the woods anymore. He was in the past, sitting across from a man he'd never met, who somehow knew this moment would come. "If you're hearing this, then they never told you the truth about the fire." The voice paused. A long, weighted silence. Then, "It wasn't an accident. It was meant to erase everything. Me. Charlotte. The child." Ansel's throat tightened. The child. Could that have been his mother? Or someone else entirely? The next part of the recording sent a chill down his spine. "They said I was unstable. Said I needed to disappear. But I left clues, because one day, someone like you would come looking. Someone with my eyes, my stubbornness." Ansel blinked hard, trying to keep his hands from shaking. He thought of his mother, how guarded she was, how she'd never answered his questions about Harlan. What had she been protecting him from? Hiding. Bramble stood quietly behind him, unusually still. As the tape continued, Harlan gave instructions, coordinates, names, memories encoded into numbers. One stood out, Oswin Granger. "He knows everything. If he's still alive, he's your next step." Ansel fumbled through his bag for the notebook. Granger had been mentioned before, scribbled in the margins like an afterthought. Now he wasn't a footnote, he was the key. As the tape ended, the forest returned. Wind rustled through the tall pine branches, and Bramble finally let out a soft huff. The moment had passed, but its weight remained. Ansel knew now that he wasn't just following a trail. He was part of a plan someone had died for. Maybe more than one. He carefully placed the recorder back in the box and stared down at the ground where the stone had rested. This wasn't just a hiding place. It was a message. A buried truth, meant to be uncovered by blood. Ansel stood slowly, glancing back in the direction they had come from. It was time to find Oswin Granger. The trail to Oswin Granger's property wasn't on any map. The directions from Harlan's tape were vague at best. Past the old orchard, follow the dry creek, red mailbox with no house. It sounded like a riddle, but as Ansel and Bramble moved deeper into the foothills, things began to align. The trees changed again, shorter, older, fruitless. The orchard was real. Abandoned, but still standing, its twisted apple trees reaching out like crooked hands under the overcast sky. At the edge of the orchard, Ansel found the mailbox, dented, rusted, and without a flag. Just as Harlan had said. No house in sight. Just silence. Bramble paused beside him, ears twitching, sensing the change in the air. Ansel didn't hesitate. He followed the path behind the mailbox, barely more than a deer trail, until he saw it. A small cabin tucked between two ridges, almost invisible from a distance. Smoke curled faintly from the chimney. Someone was home. He approached slowly, heart pounding. The front door was open just a crack, and from inside came the low hum of a radio, static and old country music mixed together. Ansel raised his hand to knock but stopped when a voice called out, raspy and sharp. No need to knock. If you made it this far, you might as well come in. The voice had the weight of years, but also something sharper, like someone who hadn't trusted the world in a long time. Inside, the cabin was cluttered but warm. Shelves filled with faded books, newspapers, tools, and maps covered the walls. At the far end, in a worn armchair, sat a man with gray hair down to his shoulders and eyes like weathered glass, Oswin Granger. He didn't stand, just stared at Ansel with something close to recognition. You've got Harlan's eyes, he said. Didn't think I'd ever see those again. Ansel didn't speak at first. He just nodded and handed Granger the notebook. The old man took it slowly, flipping through the pages like they were sacred. So he finally sent someone, he muttered. Took him long enough. His voice broke slightly, but he masked it quickly. What do you want to know, boy? Because if you're here, it means you're ready to learn everything your mother was too afraid to tell you. Ansel sat down across from him, pulse in his throat. I want to know why they burned everything, and what they were trying to hide. Granger leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Then I hope you're ready, kid. Because what they buried, it wasn't just your grandfather's past. It was yours. Oswin Granger poured 2 cups of coffee from an old steel pot and slid one across the table. Ansel barely touched it. His hands were too cold, too tight with anticipation. Granger took a long sip, then leaned back, the notebook resting on his knee like a sacred text. You ever hear of Project Ashfield? He asked. Ansel shook his head. Didn't think so. That's the point. Government cleanup program back in the 90s. Supposedly for wildfire prevention. But in truth, it was about relocating people quietly. Ansel blinked. Relocating. Granger nodded. They came after folks who lived off-grid. Isolated families. Said they were a threat to infrastructure. But really, they were covering something up. Your grandfather was one of the first to fight back. He had records. Evidence. Charlotte Wexler helped him hide it. When they wouldn't hand it over, that's when the fire happened. His voice cracked, then lowered. They burned the homestead to the ground with people still inside. Ansel's breath caught. You mean they killed them? Granger didn't answer right away. He stared into the steam rising from his cup. They erased them. Same thing in the end. He opened the notebook and pointed to a map. These markings? They were locations of the others, families like yours. People who disappeared without a trace. Your mother was just a child when it happened. Harlan got her out. But they made him disappear too. Said he was mentally unstable. Said he wandered into the mountains and never came back. Ansel sat frozen. The weight of it was too much. His whole life, he'd been told that silence meant safety. But silence was a cover. His family had been buried under lies and fire. Why didn't anyone say anything? He asked, voice barely above a whisper. Granger let out a bitter laugh. Who'd listen? By the time I figured it out, the Wexlers were gone, the records were missing, and Harlan, well, he was living like a ghost. He looked straight at Ansel. Until he found a way to leave the truth behind. For you. Ansel reached into his bag and pulled out the recorder. He left this too. Granger's eyes softened. Then he trusted you more than anyone. He stood up slowly, walked to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a metal box. Inside were old documents, photos, and a worn ID badge. U.S. Department of Forestry, Harlan Ridgway. He handed it to Ansel. This is what they were afraid of. He saw something he wasn't supposed to. And now they know someone else does too. Outside, the wind had shifted. Something, or someone, was coming. The wind howled louder now, pushing against the cabin as if trying to warn them. Granger bolted the front door without speaking, then turned to Ansel with urgency in his eyes. We don't have much time, he said. Someone's been watching this ridge. I've seen signs for weeks. Ansel clutched the ID badge in his hand, heart pounding. They're coming for this, aren't they? Granger nodded. And for you. Together, they stuffed the documents and tapes into Granger's weathered backpack. We need to get to the ranger station, he said. It's the only place left that still has radio access. If we transmit this before they catch up, someone will have to listen. Bramble, sensing the tension, stood ready at the edge of the trail. The animal had guided Ansel this far like he'd known the way all along. Now, he would carry the truth out of the woods. The hike down the ridge was steep, cold, and quiet, too quiet. Every snapped twig sent adrenaline rushing through Ansel's veins. But they didn't stop. For the first time, he didn't feel afraid. He felt resolved. Everything his mother had hidden, everything Harlan had tried to preserve, was now in his hands. He wasn't just walking through his family's past anymore. He was walking toward their redemption. By dusk, they reached the ranger station, a squat concrete building half buried in snow, long since decommissioned but still standing. Granger broke the lock with a crowbar and headed straight for the dusty control panel. "Help me power this up," he muttered. Ansel followed his lead, flipping old switches until the faint hum of electricity buzzed through the walls. Then, finally, static turned to a faint tone. The radio was live. Granger keyed the mic. "This is Oswin Granger, former Department of Forestry, broadcasting from Station Echo 3. I have evidence of illegal operations, arson, and government-sanctioned erasures connected to Project Ashfield." He paused. "We're transmitting the truth." They fed the documents through the scanner, the audio through the recorder. It was raw. It was messy. But it was real. Ansel watched the data stream through with silent intensity, every second a small rebellion. When it was done, they sat in silence, waiting. No response came. But the transmission had gone out. Someone, somewhere, would hear it. Maybe not today, but someday. And that was enough. Granger looked at Ansel, weary but relieved. "You did it," he said. "You finished what your grandfather started." Outside, the wind had finally died down. Snow began to fall. Light, gentle. And for the first time in his life, Ansel Ridgway felt truly free.